This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just allow a little bit of a moment for people to file into the Zoom room, as is customary. But I'll begin. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. It's absolutely a great pleasure to welcome you to today's event on this important topic, where we're going to be hearing from Gert Jan Koopman, who's the Director General at the Director General for Neighbourhood and Enlargement Negotiations, DG NEAR, in the European Commission. The event will follow the same format as is conventional. I'll just have the pleasure in a moment of introducing the speaker a little more formally to tell us exactly who he is. But it's just worth noting today, obviously, is a big day in Ireland. I, like many others, I'm in my home place to cast my vote as our general election will take place. Unlike most European countries, we do it rather quickly. So we've had a 3-week campaign, and we should have a sense of how things are looking over the coming days. But for that reason, it's an exciting time to be involved or talking in this format. And secondly, as well, this week we also marked a very important moment where the European Commission, the College of Commissioners under President von der Leyen, was invested in Brussels, in Strasbourg, excuse me, where the vote took place. So for both of those entities, for the Irish Republic and indeed for the European Union, enlargement is an extremely important topic. Ireland, arguably one of the great success stories of enlargement, a country that arrived in the first enlargement round in 1973, and the country's been transformed economically and socially ever since, largely because associated with Ireland's EU membership. So looking forward to the discussion with you, Gert Jan. I'm merely going to introduce you now and hand over to you. Gert Jan Koopman is the Director General of DG NEAR since January 2023. In this role, Mr. Koopman oversees the EU's neighbourhood and enlargement negotiations, supporting countries in the southern and eastern neighbourhood and promoting EU values in the region. Previously, Gert Jan was Director General of the European Commission's Budget Department from 2018 to 2023. In this role, he contributed to putting in place the European Union's 800 billion NextGenerationEU recovery plan, a game changer amidst the COVID pandemic, as well as the 18 billion macro financial assistance for Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion of that country. Before that, Mr. Koopman was Deputy Director General in DG Competition, responsible for state aid control. He joined the European Commission in 1991 as an administrator in the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and Mr. Koopman graduated with degrees in economics and classics from the University of Amsterdam. I also believe this isn't the first time you've spoken with us, Gert Jan. The last time it was in person, and it was in Dublin. So it's really nice to reconnect with you, albeit digitally this time. I'm going to hand over to you now. Our expectations, you'll have 15-20 minutes or so to regale us with an address, and then we'll move straight to a quick discussion with myself and a Q&A. As ever, this discussion, for those joining us online, is on the record. You can participate in the discussion using the Twitter X handle @IIEA, and if you have questions, please do insert them into the Q&A function on Zoom. That's it from me. Gert Jan, a very sincere welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barry. Very good to be back, even if it's virtually. I would have much preferred to be in Dublin, and I will always also be looking very carefully at the results of your elections this evening. I think doing this in just 3 weeks clearly is a best practice, which we should be looking at more widely across the EU. Now, the topic for my talk today is indeed very important. Enlargement, as reflected in the enlargement package adopted in October of this year, on the 30th of October, is right at the top of the policy agenda and has been there since the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And in fact, it has gained momentum over these past few years in a way that very few people could have imagined just at the start of the previous mandate. We are now transitioning into a new mandate on the 1st of December. A new set of commissioners will be taking over, and we had the farewell party of our outgoing commissioner who recalled how when he was given the portfolio back in 2019, it was seen as an area where probably very little was going to happen. But the world has changed dramatically, and let me just illustrate that. Back in 2019, we were looking at 7 partners who were relevant for enlargement, who wanted to join. And there are 10 today. More importantly, I think back in the day, we had 5 candidate countries who we had officially granted candidate status to. Today, that's 9, so nearly doubled. And more impressively, back in 2019, we were negotiating. So we had opened negotiations with 3 countries. Today, we're negotiating with 7 countries. So, just looking at it factually, statistically, clearly there is momentum. But I think there's something else that has changed. And that is that whilst enlargement was seen very much as something we were doing for the candidate countries, I think today we see enlargement as a political initiative that is of geostrategic importance also for the EU. So in that sense, it's become more symmetric, I believe. And I often think that enlargement in a way leverages the economic superpower of the European Union because it brings countries into the world's largest internal market. And it has this economic and social transformative effect, which you refer to, Barry, for Ireland, but it's true for the Baltics, it's true for Poland, it's true for, frankly, many new member states as the Union expands. Of course, accession is much more than a socio-economic development. We need to be very clear about that. It also means that the countries internalize fully and sign up to the European values set out in Article 2 of the treaty, and share an economic, social, and political space that has a huge impact on the countries themselves. Interestingly, the Union itself is also transformed by enlargement, and I think the EU as it is today feels and looks rather different to the EU which you refer to. I joined back in 1991. So it's a very dynamic process. I think there is no historic precedent for it. Economically, beyond any doubt, a massive success. Anyone who wants to see that should just walk the streets of Dublin, or more, for a more recent example, go to Vilnius, go to Warsaw. These countries just look completely different, and you will also find the greatest protagonists of enlargement in the new member states, because people have the real life experience and still sense it, which in some of the older member states has maybe not been so visible in the recent past. Now, let me talk a little bit about the enlargement process. I'm sorry to use the word process. I promised myself not to use it, but there I go. It is very firmly merit-based, and it depends on objective progress achieved by our partner countries, anchored on the Copenhagen criteria and the reforms that are needed to internalize all areas of EU law. At the heart, since the new enlargement methodology, are the so-called fundamentals, the rule of law, justice system, which are foundational for any state, and are fundamental. So they remain the cornerstones of the enlargement process. And we actually open negotiations nowadays by opening the fundamentals cluster, as we say. We group these areas in clusters. And we only close it as the last cluster. So it very clearly circumscribes the whole process. I already referred to values. The promotion of EU values is essential. And therefore, especially in these very troubled times, alignment with the EU's common foreign and security policy is a more important signal than it has ever been. I talked a bit about economics already, and if you look at where the Baltics are today and where they were at the time of the Great Enlargement, now 20 years ago, they nearly doubled their GDP per capita, so their income per head of the population. And today, looking at the Western Balkans, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, we see that their GDP per capita is well below 50% of that of the EU. The Western Balkans, it stands at about 35% obviously Ukraine is very poor. And that clearly signals that we are looking at a very big challenge, which is why, and this is new, we have put the emphasis much more squarely on progressive or gradual integration, whereby we try to front load reforms, so obligations, if you will, but match that with benefits by giving new countries, partner countries, access to the internal market on the condition that they undertake the necessary reforms, thereby speeding up the process of convergence and allowing the countries to prepare themselves better. It's very important economically because it closes the convergence gap and therefore makes enlargement much easier. But it's also important from a political economy point of view, and I want to labor that point a little bit. When you joined, enlargement was a process where, yes, you needed to put the acquis on the statute books, and that took a bit of time, but the acquis was relatively small. The acquis, in other words, the corpus of EU legislation nowadays is certainly twice as large. If you count it by the number of pages it covers in the official journal, very crude metric, but still, as it was 20 years ago. So enlargement is a bigger task now than it was back then. Also because the Union is much more active in various parts of our economic and political ecosystems than it was back then. The traditional way of doing enlargement, where the reforms which carry a political cost obviously precede the benefits which flow after enlargement actually happens, therefore becomes more challenging. And the logic of progressive or gradual integration is to better align in time, to synchronize, if you will, these costs and benefits, thereby motivating the countries, the partner countries, and at the same time also making enlargement for the existing EU 27 easier. So we've moved a lot in this regard and rolled out economic growth plans for the Western Balkans, which have started delivering now, for Ukraine through the Ukraine facility. And recently we have proposed a similar plan for Moldova, all based on the logic of linking reforms to support for investments and the budget, very much anchored on the logic of NextGenerationEU, this big reform program you just referred to, which we set up for our own member states in the wake of the COVID crisis. I'll just quickly run through a few important points here to give you a sense of what happened in 2024, because that is really what our enlargement package sets out in a bit more detail. But before I do that, I want to make one further observation, which is that in the past months, what we have seen is a dramatic change in the countries themselves, because on the back of this progressive integration, the geopolitical environment, and frankly, the acceleration in reform pace, we see that partner countries are beginning to set ambitious targets for completing the negotiations themselves. Montenegro has set itself a target of closing the accession negotiations by the end of 2026. Albania, which has just started the negotiations, frankly, set itself the target of doing that by the end of 27. And Serbia has very recently set itself the target of doing that by the end of 26. And others are looking at the same question in a lot of detail. I think we should not underestimate the importance of this development. This is not, let me be very clear, the Union setting a date for accession. No, this is the partner countries setting their own target to be ready. And I must say, of course, we have worked with these countries to help them formulate these targets in a realistic but ambitious manner. And we believe that these targets are stretched, certainly, but they are realistic. We haven't seen that in a very, very long time. We haven't seen that, frankly, since Croatia joined the EU back in 2013. So there is also momentum qualitatively in terms of how the countries approach this. And having a target comes with a planning. What needs to be done? When? In order to get there. And I'm not going to go into the technicity of the enlargement process, but there are interim steps that have to be taken before you can move forward. So from this target, you then derive planning, which means also that there is an accountability device for your government, for the ministries, and a monitoring device so that we can actually check whether you're on track or not on track. And we can also plan the work in the council and our technical assistance in function of this planning. So this, I think, is actually really a very big change indeed. As I've said, Montenegro set itself this target, and we are now in the business, after passing this closure of the interim benchmarks, we're on a track to start provisionally closing chapters. We are aiming at closing 4 chapters next month. In the previous mandate, 5 chapters in total were closed across all negotiating partners. So this is actually huge. I should also note, coming back to the theme of progressive integration, that earlier this month, actually last week, Montenegro and Albania became the first ever enlargement partners to join the single euro payment area, which is an area within which you can transfer money very speedily and without cost, saving these countries anywhere between 10 and 20% of the value of transactions in transaction cost. Hugely important, therefore, for citizens and for businesses. I mean, for citizens, this is comparable in some ways to visa-free travel. We know that Serbia and North Macedonia are very hot on the heels of these two, and probably likely to get there as well early next year. So Montenegro definitely is on a roll. It's closing chapters, it's joining SEPA, it set itself the target for the end of 26. And as I said, I've deemed that realistic. Albania, after opening cluster 1, it is aiming at opening cluster 6 later this month, which is the external affairs cluster. Also very realistic. Council has started the preparations, and that therefore means that a country that has just started on its track would already by the end of this year have opened 2 of the 6 clusters. Serbia has had a very slow pace of reforms over a long period of time, but as I said, now seems to have begun turning the corner, and we are working very hard with the presidency to open cluster 3 on competitiveness. We believe that this could open the door for a very different trajectory for Serbia. And given that it's the largest economy in the Western Balkans, given its historical ties with Russia, I also think this is a monumental development. North Macedonia needs to still meet the conditions set by the Council, namely to introduce constitutional amendments recognizing the right of minorities in order to be able to move forward with the opening of its first cluster. It used to be running in parallel with Albania. It's now accumulated a little bit of a backlog, but I'm optimistic that the country will find a way forward and hopefully, possibly rejoin Albania on what is a very fast track. Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is arguably the most complicated country in the region, we all know this. After a very, very difficult period, actually started making reforms, and the council decided back in 22 to open negotiations, accession negotiations. That was actually confirmed earlier this year, and we are now looking forward to a number of steps which the country needs to take before the negotiating framework can be adopted. And therefore, whilst this is a very complicated country, it had elections as a result of which the momentum that prevailed until March was slowed down. We remain optimistic that it will also advance. Kosovo, the 6th of the Western Balkan partners, has applied for membership back in 2022. Here, progress is slow. Council needs to invite the Commission to assess its membership application. Recently, both between Serbia and Kosovo, the progress of normalization between the two partners through the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue has not advanced very well, and Kosovo is also holding elections on the 9th of February next year, and I think that's also a factor that plays a certain role in the extent to which they are aligning. Now, Turkey is a candidate country. It's a key partner. But as you know, since 2018, the accession negotiations are at a standstill because they are essentially blocked on account of backsliding in several key areas, notably the fundamentals. But we're re-engaging in a more transactional approach where our strong economic ties, after all, we share a customs union with Turkey, and economic and political ties and security interests are looked at, fully taking account of the need to make progress on the Cyprus challenge, the Cyprus problem. And this progressive, proportionate, and reversible work we're doing is beginning to bear fruit. I would, for example, expect the EIB to be re-engaging in Turkey. We actually have a mandate to work with them to do that. I would also expect that the good work that is being undertaken in terms of trade irritants and sanction sanction circumvention, anti-sanction circumvention, I should say, that this will lead to a further momentum. Turning to the East, of course, the opening of the accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, for the reasons that I highlighted right at the start of my talk, was absolutely monumental. Opened the negotiations in June, further to just after they were declared candidate countries in the summer of 22. So breakneck speed, serious reform efforts despite an impossibly difficult situation in Ukraine. But I want to underline that this was earned on merit, and that the opening is therefore fully justified. In other words, let me be very clear. The merit-based principle is not, I repeat, not being sacrificed on the altar of geostrategic and geopolitical interests. In fact, what we have seen is that the country, and I would say also the EU system, has worked extremely hard to do both at the same time. Moldova is also moving forward. Both countries benefit, as I said, from growth plans. Ukraine through a 50 billion euros Ukraine facility running until the end of 27, and Moldova will hopefully very soon benefit from its own reform and growth facility, which we hope will enter into force soonest. Now, the third country in the East, Georgia, was granted candidate status last year, but unfortunately seems to have lost its way. Let me use this form of words, in that after the passing of a number of very problematic laws, including a foreign agents law, the council decided to suspend negotiations. And just recently, in fact, yesterday, the prime minister of the country announced that he wants to suspend Georgia's work on the EU path until 28. There are many issues here, also in terms of the quality of the elections. The country's population is staunchly pro-European, 80 to 90%. Stopping the EU track until 28 seems to go right against what the vast majority of Georgians want. So we will need to look at how we address this issue. It's clearly a disappointing development. Now, let me be clear. I don't want to speculate about whether these ambitious targets and the developments in the East, which are so positive in Ukraine and Moldova in terms of the enlargement track, will lead to enlargement in the next mandate. But what I can say is that the momentum is actually translating into real action on the ground, and that technically this process of gradual integration, accelerating accession negotiations, economic reforms, rising living standards, ties us up for a path that looks very similar to the path that the generation of 2004 member states were on just before enlargement. So clearly, for the incoming Commission, this will be a massively significant challenge. Now, in closing, I want to just pause for a second on what it means for the EU 27, because taking in new member states, of course, is something we haven't done for over a decade now. We've signaled that reforms are needed in any event in a number of areas, and we are screening the EU's policy areas for what enlargement might mean. But we're not saying that the potentially additional reforms that would be desirable are a necessary condition for enlargement. I see the two as very much going hand in hand dynamically, as they always do. And finally, I would also like to underline that enlargement ultimately is something that's decided by the peoples of our countries. And we know that it's quite likely that people will be asked to express themselves, possibly through a referendum. So a huge challenge for the incoming Commission, for the partner countries and the EU27 is actually to organize genuinely intensive and open debates about enlargement in our member states. I'm not talking about lecturing. I'm not talking about communicating the benefits of enlargement and repeating it if people don't get the message. I'm talking about genuine debate to make sure that the benefits of enlargement, which you refer to at the start of this talk and which I refer to, are actually fully taken into account, as are the challenges that no doubt will arise as we move forward. So a very full agenda going into this new mandate, a lot to play for, as they say, in a number of sports, and all of that in a context that has radically changed, where frankly the security of the EU and the geostrategic context are completely new dimensions that we are addressing very, very fully. Many thanks.
Gert Jan, thank you very much. I have to say it was a pleasure hearing you and sensing the optimism that you still have for this process, if I can put it that way. And also just generally what came through is your remarkable history with the institutions. If you've been there since 1991, the amount of transformative change you've seen, that's pre-Maastricht, I guess. So I mean the kind of rate, pace, and depth of change you must have observed really came across in your remarks. And it's very clear, as you depict, enlargement is it's of geostrategic significance. It's had a transformative impact on member states. Of course, when I mentioned Ireland, I wasn't saying only Ireland, but on every member state, I would argue it's had a largely positive, if not entirely positive impact. But we do get a sense from your remarks that the stakes are really high, needless to say, not just because of the war in Ukraine, but I would argue the stakes have always been high. You know, back to the very start, the Second World War, the fall of the dictators in the 70s and 80s, the collapse of the USSR. Leadership was always found to bring the enlargement process forward and indeed integration forward. And I can just hope as a citizen, as a European, that it'll be found again. The final thought I'm having before we move to the questions, of which there are plenty. I have loads myself, but you can see the little red button. Gert Jan, you've elicited many thoughts from those who are watching. Pat Cox, who's a former president of the European Parliament and he's a member of our board and an active member of our institute, I'm delighted to say. He is very well known to Ukraine, and Ukraine is known to him. And he often reminds us that Ukraine is large, it is agricultural, and it is poor. And based on what you were saying about the proportion of GDP, Ukraine compared to the EU, another country joined in the 1970s that was small, agricultural, and poor, and it was also 50% of the EEC's GDP at the time. So it isn't just about leadership, obviously. I mean, size matters when we're talking about enlargement, but I just think that's an important footnote from the other edge of Europe to Ukraine, that Ireland came in somewhat similar circumstances. I'm going to put one or two questions to you before dipping into the Q&A. First of all, it's a predictable one to an Irish audience. Do you think enlargement can happen on the scale that you've depicted without treaty reform?
It's a very good question. It's hotly debated. I personally think that the answer is yes. But it's definitely also true that it would be easier if we reform the treaties in some respects. However, there is a sometimes undue pessimism about what we can do with the treaties as they stand today. And there's an undue pessimism, generally speaking, I think, about European decision making. Let me refer to the debates that took place about financing Ukraine over the past year and contrast the European experience with the US experience. The US has a very streamlined decision-making process. It's a very polarized political system. We have a very complicated system, 27 member states, unanimity requirements in certain areas. But let us also remind ourselves of a very important fact, namely that European support of Ukraine, despite the challenges we have in terms of our decision-making processes, was never interrupted.
Mm.
The US actually, unfortunately, saw a very long period earlier this year where support was halted. So, we tend to work very well with the challenges we have. It's not optimal, but I'm a Dutchman. We're in my country. We're living a very complicated political landscape today. A government that is unique in terms of its non-parliamentary anchor in terms of its ministers, and it is also functioning. So we shouldn't compare our ideas of what is an optimal governance system with reality, and then say that if there's a delta, there is a massive problem. Also, there are possibilities within the existing treaties to move towards more QMV, because that's ultimately the underlying issue. And finally, if I look at the enlargement process itself, we could do a lot of things more efficiently, I believe, without actually changing any of the decision-making rules. And frankly speaking, that's what we have been doing. I think the process needs to be faster. It's become quite complicated. There are many intermediary steps, not all of which are necessary. So for all those reasons, I am optimistic that this can be done without treaty change. But it's clear if we could change the treaties, and it's not as above my pay grade to speculate on that, then that would even be speedier.
An Irish audience is very sensitive to these discussions. My kind of first political experiences that I can remember were EU treaties that passed, didn't pass, then passed in recent Irish history. I've one more short question, and then I'm conscious there's great activity from the audience, which I appreciate, and I'll start dipping into those questions in a moment. It's a simple question, but it invites an entirely different webinar. Just around the topic of competitiveness. Competitiveness today, for me, as a European studies researcher, is the strategic autonomy of 2 years ago, in that any forum, any meeting, any discussion tends to revolve back to competitiveness and its importance, obviously derived from the excellent work of Mario Draghi in his recent report. You hinted at this in your remarks, but can you say whether is there an obvious trade-off between Europe being as competitive as it can be as it currently stands and enlargement, or can the two go hand in hand?
Actually, I think enlargement could contribute significantly to competitiveness. And in fact, that's what it did back in 2004. What happened back in 2004 is that European industry availed itself of a much larger internal market and production locations that were much more cost effective, gaining competitive strength in the process. The Czech Republic was transformed into the heart of Autoland in Europe. Car manufacturing took off big time for obvious reasons. Unit labor costs were much lower. The location to the geographical distance to markets was quite small, and the EU had invested massively in transport infrastructures. So the cost to market was also quite low. So having a bigger internal market, having lower cost production sites is definitely good for enlargement. And I think we should look at Ukraine, not today, not tomorrow, but in the long run, strategically, as a massive strength for the EU. It's got an agricultural sector, I'm sure we'll come to that in the discussions, that is a powerhouse. It's got gas storages, which will be a powerhouse. It's got space. It's got critical raw materials. It's got a big population that is actually relatively well educated, is young, is growing. So we need to see these countries not just for what they are today, but for what they are likely to be if the EU transformative enlargement process does what it always does, namely to boost them. And that, I think, is really important. So the benefits for our business environment, for European industry, of a well-designed enlargement process can be very significant indeed. And that's one of the critical arguments we need to have in our member states, in the EU 27, when we debate enlargement.
Indeed. And indeed, the I listened carefully to discussions around food security and other things as well, and Ukraine being such a productive agricultural place, it can contribute to our food security. And I also hope after going to the questions now, but lessons will have been learned from the post 2004 enlargement in terms of social dumping, and there's obviously important legislation, posting workers directive and various associated things to prevent the exploitation of those economic efficiencies that can be found by enlargement. I'm going to go to the questions now. I should say as well, I just note from those who are in attendance, hello everybody. I note many people from our foreign ministry. I should have noted, of course, I was just in a rush getting off my bike, starting this event, that this event is part of our Future Proofing Europe series. It's the 9th event this year, just to thank the DFA, the Department of Foreign Affairs, for sponsoring this work, and I look forward to many future excellent engagements such as this one. The first question I'm going to put to you, Gert Jan, is from Teresa Riley. How are you, Teresa? Teresa says, in the context of the unfolding situation in Georgia, which you mentioned, and the announcement by the ruling party that that country would halt its EU bid and the ensuing protests and unrest, which you had mentioned, there's a sense that Georgia is missing a unique window of opportunity to join the enlargement wave. Is there still time for Georgia to turn things around? If so, what would the next steps be? Now, you mentioned this, but do you have anything to say about whether it's possible for them to turn things around?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Personally, I'm very sad that the government made this announcement. It's ultimately something which seems to be completely antithetical to what the population wants. Can it still be turned around? I think it can be turned around. I'm not sure that this is what is going to happen over the next year or so. I know that in the Georgian system, there is a lot of discussion. Actually, we've seen many diplomats posting on the social media very strong messages that they disagree with this. It seems to be an announcement by the Prime Minister. Maybe it could be discussed if they so wish. And we have to see how this is formalized, if it is formalized. So my own take on this is that it's very clear what the Georgian government needs to do. There are two laws which we have been very clear about are not compatible with the EU path. One relates to foreign agents, and the other relates to what is called values. It's essentially an anti-LGBTIQ law. Both laws, as they stand today, are not compatible with the EU path. And I think these laws should go. Then there's the 9 steps, which are preconditions actually for moving forward on the enlargement path, which Georgia has backpedaled on and needs to re-engage. And if Georgia is ready to get rid of those 2 laws, and they got rid of the foreign agent law, let us not forget, back in 2023, before putting it back on the statute books this year, then I see no reason why we couldn't re-engage with them. It's a choice ultimately for Georgia, and it seems to be the clear wish of the Georgian people to move forward on this. So, I think it's a surprising announcement. Doesn't really fit with anything the government has said in the past. Doesn't fit with what the people seem to want. So let us see how this plays out.
Thanks very much, Gert Jan. I note a question here about a country that came up in your remarks, but I think a lot of people are spending time thinking about Serbia. And Toby Vogel, great to have you here, Toby. It's been a while. He's at the Democratization Policy Council in Brussels, and I'm sure Toby's known to you, a well-known expert on the region and on the subject. Toby says, I'll read at length, the 2024 report on Serbia noted backsliding, no progress, or very limited progress on a number of issues. The country's foreign policy alignment has further decreased, elections are marred by serious irregularities, and the dialogue with Kosovo, which you mentioned, has failed to produce any progress. Question, on what basis do you believe that Serbia's 2026 goal is realistic in the light of all this? Also, given that Serbia would have to normalize relations with Kosovo and impose sanctions against the Kremlin before it can do so.
Well, absolutely. I mean, clearly, Serbia is coming from a position which is not compatible with very fast accession. That is absolutely clear. Serbia also has a traditional cultural link to the Slavic world and to Russia that is a bit different from some of the other partners. But what gives me reason for optimism is that since this new momentum has really taken hold, I have detected a very significant shift in the discussions in Belgrade, and not just in the discussions, but also in the actions. It's tricky if you find yourself in this position as Serbia to evolve your position, because you don't start from the same position as some of the other partner countries. But it's interesting to note, for example, that Serbia has made three non-enlargement related choices that are actually quite important geostrategically. One is that they've made available more ammunition to Ukraine than any other Western Balkans partner, and frankly, than many of our member states, even some very big member states. That is not nothing if you think about it. Secondly, a very significant lithium mine, which was clearly targeted by the Chinese and the Americans, because this is essential for batteries production. Was given in concession to essentially a European consortium. So that wasn't evident, to put it mildly. And thirdly, the country militarily, in terms of where it puts its resources, has made some very significant purchases of Mirage fighter jets in France. Why do I come with these examples? Because they're not directly enlargement related, and they're certainly not related to the fundamentals. But they're nevertheless very important. These are not so straightforward. And had you asked anyone on this call 2 or 3 years ago whether they would have expected this outcome, I'm sure they wouldn't have. They'll be opening an embassy in Ukraine shortly. They've given more aid, grants to Ukraine than any other Western Balkan partner. And following these discussions, I actually myself had meetings with the Serbian government, formulating also the concerns that exist about the key issues which were just mentioned. And when the government then fixed its 26 target, I said, listen, what member states will want to see is action. Intentions are good. Action is going to be necessary. And since that happened just 3 weeks ago, Serbia has increased its alignment rate of the CFSP from 51% in the enlargement report to 58%, just in 3 weeks. 51%, 58%. It has taken commitments with regards to implementing recommendations from ODIHR on the electoral reform that are very far-reaching. Actually, a lot of these things are drafted by committees in their parliament involving not just the opposition, but actually CSOs. This was one of the recommendations on the process that they have taken on board. Long-standing concerns about media freedom and media functioning, necessitating the appointment of an independent council supervising this, the so-called REM Council. Well, after these discussions, they promised just 3 weeks ago finally to publish a call to set out very clearly the conditions for independence of these members and for the independence of this board, this REM Council. They published it. They said they would publish it Wednesday this week, so 2 days ago, and they published it. And they have announced that they will hold an extraordinary session of parliament. They'll make their parliament come back from its recess in January to appoint these people. And finally, they have committed also to an audit of the voter lists as part of the action plan to tidy that up, and the adoption of a number of important media laws that we have validated as conform with the acquis. I'm just giving some very concrete examples to show that, in my view, this is not just about grand announcements. This is actually about taking concrete action and making choices. And I think for the country to so publicly now announce the 26 target is a big thing. Yes, there's also ministers traveling to Moscow saying all sorts of things. That is clear, and that is something which over time will have to change. But we should look through some of the couleur locale, if I can use a French term, and remind ourselves of where this country was just 2-3 years ago to see what is actually happening. It's very important. Serbia's role in the Western Balkans is very important. There are Serbs in many Western Balkans countries, the biggest economy. So we all also ourselves have a very big interest in the country moving towards Europe. It's really important, and I sense on the basis of the examples that I've given, that actually something is really changing. And I think that is not just based on speculation, it's based on fact.
Thank you for that answer and for all the rich context you're able to answer. You're able to provide in your answers here, Jan. Conscious of what we said before about your time, that you have a hard finish at the hour. So just we have a multitude of questions. If anybody wants to get something in, please try and do so in the next couple of moments. I'll pick one now from Erwan Forêt, if I'm saying your name correct, Erwan, from the Centre for European Policy Studies. It's good to have you with us. This addresses something that you did speak about in your remarks. So Erdogan acknowledges the use of veto power by individual member states when it came to accession criteria. He gave the examples of Bulgaria, Macedonia, in the past, similarly with Greece and Cyprus. And Erdogan asks, are there any moves, you did address this specifically, are there any moves to try and limit the use of veto power and introduce more QMV in the accession process? Sounds tricky. Does the Commission intend to develop a comprehensive strategy or mechanism to deal with the many bilateral disputes which exist and which thwart the accession process for kind of non-merit-based reasons?
We could talk about this. Is a very good question. It touches on a really important issue, or actually two issues. So we could talk the whole afternoon. I'll just say two things, keeping the time in mind. One, on the decision-making processes, I think the name of the game is simplification. We tend to set a lot of conditions that are actually are not needed. So if you don't set these conditions for every step on the road, but you set them where it really matters, you simplify the process, and it doesn't actually lead to any changes in QMV. But there's also a paper drafted by the Germans and the Slovenians highlighting how for procedural steps you could move to QMV. That's definitely something we need to look at. On the bilateral issues, they are actually really important. We need a framework for this, especially in the Western Balkans. Reconciliation has not been achieved, and that's something we need to work on. In the context of the accession process, I find, and let me be a bit critical, that we haven't done enough ourselves. We know these issues are big. We need to work with the countries, and the European Commission should be much more active in brokering agreements and being on the ball. This is not something we can just leave to them. We need to be much more active, and we need to use the power of the accession process itself to build in these elements. And that's also very true for Pristina Belgrade. We have a dialogue that's been going nowhere for a long time, unfortunately. But if we have an accession process with Serbia and hopefully later with Kosovo, then actually this should be part of the accession process. We have our own responsibility. So I see plenty of opportunities of addressing these issues.
And it would be remiss of me not to say that I obviously have colleagues in both places, and I very often speak about, by both places I mean Pristina and Belgrade, and I often speak about the Irish experience, as parochial as it is. Every conflict is utterly different, but it is well documented and just a known truth that shared EU membership fed into the habits of cooperation, which brought about ultimately peace in Northern Ireland. And I think it's important to remember the role that the kind of familiarization, especially at the official level, played in that. We'll have time for 2-3 more questions if I'm quick. The next question I'll give to you, Gert Jan, comes from Brigadier General Ger Hearn. Great to have you with us, Ger. Ger is a member of the Institute, and he says, are the delays of countries in Southeastern Europe being allowed, the delays for countries in Southeastern Europe in terms of their joining the EU, is that driving those countries incrementally into the arms and influence of Russia and China? Another big question.
Yeah. So this is why the new momentum is so important. I think if we get this wrong, then I fear that may exactly be what will happen. And let us not be naive. I think Russia, China, and to some extent other actors in the region may have a strong interest in those outcomes. So that's why I'm saying the accession process is also in our interest. The countries need to do hard reforms, but we also need to work harder. And we need to make it easier where we can without cutting any corners. Don't get me wrong. So if we bungle this, we will also pay a price. And certainly on my watch, that is not what I want to happen now. Thank you.
A question from Lucas Schaefer, who is from Schumann Associates. Good to have you with us, Lucas. Ultimately, his question concerns the relations between the enlargement package and the reform and growth facility. In your view, Gert Jan, are there synergies between these two frameworks, and how can countries benefit the most of both facilities, the reform and growth facility and the enlargement package?
Yeah. No, so in the Reform and Growth Facility, we have actually included a number of the really hard accession reforms. And the beauty of this instrument, as I was saying earlier, is that it's based on conditionality, hard conditionality. So you've got to do the reforms to get the money. So some of the hardest stuff we've put in the Reform and Growth Facility, which means the Reform and Growth Facility itself is not just a socio-economic tool, but it will turbocharge, so to speak, the accession process. So that's the link. And conversely, once then the accession process starts moving faster, expectations of citizens and investors will also start changing, and that will make it easier for them to make more investments in the region. So you get this virtuous circle as a result of the two processes working in tandem.
Fantastic. We're going to have time, I think, Gert Jan. I'm going to give you two questions together now, and then I have a concluding question, and this should see us finished before the hour, so you can make your next appointment. These two questions come from an example, a great success story of European integration itself. So it's an Irish student after his undergraduate in Ireland, I know, to be studying in the great university in Leiden in your home country. And it's Greg Arrowsmith. Good to have you with us, Greg. Greg asked one question which you kind of addressed, but I still would like to put it to you. He says, are you open, or would you have a view on a Cyprus-style accession for candidates such as Moldova, Serbia, and Ukraine, places where there are frozen conflicts? Is it a red line issue for the EU that all frozen territorial disputes are fully resolved before membership is granted, regardless of progress with the rest of the acquis? So that's one. It might invite just a short answer because you've kind of addressed it. And the second one from Greg, it's a good question. It's quite broad. What would you say are the lessons the EU might or should learn from the lack of progress in accession from 2013 to 2022? How would you respond to the theory that EU accession fatigue has reduced the credibility of the EU's promise of accession?
Yeah, two very good questions. I think the answer to the first question is no. But obviously, we do need to find a framework to manage it. And, Cyprus is one thing, Ukraine is another thing. So it will require a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. But you refer to the Irish experience in terms of building peace. I remember some of my predecessors were very involved in that. And if you take Serbia, Kosovo, actually, I think, this is exactly what the EU is. The EU is the world's most effective, most powerful peace process. I can say that as a Dutchman, from a country that emerged out of, completely shattered out of the Second World War and now works together very, very closely with Germany. We tend to forget that we also had our issues. In the Balkans, people tend to focus exclusively on their own issues. But Ireland, the Netherlands, a lot of member states had issues, right? And they have all been resolved in part thanks to the EU. Let's not exaggerate, it's not only the EU. So that is clear. Lessons. Yes, I think that by the old joke. Let me tell you the old joke. The old joke was that the countries were pretending to reform, and we were pretending to enlarge. And in terms of buying off our bad conscience, we gave them quite a lot of money in the process. I think this is terrible. It has led to it breeds cynicism. It breeds cronyism. It breeds all sorts of problems you don't want. Certainly not in the Balkans. And I think we have also a large share of the responsibility to bear for that. I think that time is completely over now. We're in a very different dynamic in the Balkans. But, ultimately, it's our member states that need to take the decisions. I always tell the ambassadors here in the Coreper, I'm your chief negotiator, but, you decide what happens, right? And you can kill a chief negotiator. And then if you do that too often, maybe you get a new chief negotiator, but then if it happens again, you kill the process. So we can't get that wrong again for the reasons we just discussed. It's really important that when we say we want to enlarge the union, when we set criteria and countries meet the criteria, that we then also follow suit. We have to hold our part of the bargain. I think that's absolutely critical. I think so far we are doing that. If you take Ukraine, that's not easy. We all know what happened earlier this year, but we have been holding our part of the bargain. We've been good. We've kept our word, and I think this is absolutely critical. And I tell you, I sense that our partners feel that we are serious, and that makes all the difference, because it's not easy to reform. It's not easy. You have to take on vested interests. So these governments are, they're facing big challenges. And why would you undertake those challenges if on the other side of the table you've got someone who's not sincere. So the two things are really very much linked. Thank you.
Thank you, Gert Jan. And I'm going to put a final thought to you, and you might treat your answer as any concluding remark that you'd like to share. That politics at all its levels, at the home, in the community, in the world, is often about trade-offs. If you do one thing, you can't do another. It's about the distribution of scarce resources. So in that mindset, I try and think of enlargement as I try and look at what is often said are the costs of non-enlargement. So enlargement is tricky for the reasons you've outlined, but there are huge things at stake if we choose not to enlarge, or if we end up not enlarging. Could you just maybe share any thoughts you have about what the costs of non-enlargement would be for the EU? For whatever reason, if it doesn't happen, what would happen to the EU in terms of good or bad outcomes? And indeed, if you have any concluding remarks or thoughts. And thanks a million for your time.
Thank you so much, Barry. Well, just two thoughts really. I think it's very important, that we see enlargement not as a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. And economic growth is a positive-sum game. We in Europe tend to forget that sometimes. So, everyone will be better off if we enlarge, even if there are trade-offs. Yes, there will be trade-offs, but we will have more wealth to distribute to compensate whomever is losing. There might be losers, we need to compensate them, but it's a positive-sum game for the exceeding countries and for the EU 27. And my second thought is really that, the alternative with regards to Ukraine is something I think anyone who focuses a little bit will not want to contemplate too much, because it's an awful picture. A country that, is sitting where it's sitting with more arms than people, devastated economically, fractured socially, with many people who have been traumatized by the most brutal war on the European continent since the Second World War, who were promised repeatedly by European leaders that they could join if they made the reforms. And then, in this scenario, if they make the reforms, we would be refusing them. It's not a pretty picture. It's awful for them, but it's very dangerous for us. So that's something we cannot let happen.
Very, very clear point on which to end. And here, Jan, you're going to make your meeting in a minute. Just to say a real sincere thanks. I enjoyed that very much. As I said, your decades of experience and just the clarity with which you present your thoughts is really marvelous. And just thank you once again for making time for the Institute. I look forward to checking in again in due course. I'd like to thank all of you who took the time to join and participate. And just once again to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs for sponsoring this series, Future Proofing Europe. And also to Lorcan and Tara from our team for pulling things together. Gert Jan, thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend.
Take care. Bye-bye.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.